Eagles Entertainment.
The journey to the draft is driven by AAA. AAA, roadside is their strong side. Make AAA a part of your game day today. AAA, go ahead.
With the 21st pick in the NFL Draft, the Philadelphia Eagles select.
You're listening to the Journey to the Draft podcast.
Welcome to the Journey to the Draft podcast, driven by AAA. I'm your host, Fran Duffy, and we're only a couple weeks away now from the 2020 NFL Draft. Obviously going to be unlike any NFL Draft we have seen to date. And there's a lot going on, obviously, around the world, and a lot of bigger things that are impacting other areas of our country and of the globe. But look, the NFL Draft is going to be a lot different. They're still kind of ironing out some details, it seems, but we will be bringing you, everything that you need to know about the draft leading up to it here on the Journey to the Draft podcast, driven by AAA. And that includes today, because today on Draft Buzz with Chris McPherson, with Ben Fennell, they'll be joining me as always. We're going to go kind of around the rumor mill here. Some of the late reports from some of the NFL draft insiders, from the other NFL insiders as well. We'll break down a couple of teams today, just like we did last week. We did the NFC East. Well, today we're going to do a couple of teams drafting ahead of the Eagles and the teams that I just kind of find to be very interesting. General managers that have been in place for a few years that have a little bit of a track record. So we're going to take a look at the Denver Broncos, who pick 15th overall, and the Atlanta Falcons, who pick 16th overall. So we'll just kind of take a look at those two teams, how they draft, their tendencies, some needs, some possible targets for them in the 2020 draft. And then we'll do some breakdowns here of the wide receiver position and the linebacker spot. So we'll do all of that in Draft Buzz. And pick 6, we're going to do some players that are kind of flying under the radar right now, guys that are very, very talented, but maybe flying under the radar for the top 50. So we'll talk about some guys that are maybe a little bit under talked about right now in pick 6. Then we've got some questions from you at home in our draft mailbag. But let's get things started here. It's time now for Draft Buzz.
Now it's time for Draft Buzz.
All right, guys, so this is like our, I think our 4th episode. I feel like it's our 3rd or 4th episode of doing this from our homes. As I welcome in Chris McPherson and Ben Fennell. Guys, I'll start this off like I have the last few weeks. How's everything going with you guys at home?
It's like the new normal. You're weirdly becoming accustomed to it. Hope everyone's doing well out there. I think the big thing is that if we just keep doing what we're doing, hopefully we'll get back to some sense of normalcy. Even though it's not going to be for a few weeks, certainly not before the 2020 NFL Draft takes place.
No,
yeah, all is good on my end, Fran. My sister just had a baby. I'm about to go check him out this afternoon for the first time. I'm not sure how close I'll be able to get. So kind of been removed mentally from this draft complex for the last 48 hours or so, which is kind of okay because it's so fluid and changing and moving, times and maybe adding rounds, and now it's a full ESPN broadcast and a lot of moving parts, especially if you're behind the scenes. It's like hour by hour of getting updates and news and changes. It's kind of exhausting.
I was going to say, I would ask you how your role has evolved over the last couple of weeks, but I almost don't even want to ask because
it's changed 3 times this morning alone. So yeah, I'll have to update you at the end of the show and then this afternoon. And it's a constant evolving position and evolving broadcast and evolving event, and it's pretty interesting to kind of be a part of, but it's an exhausting process to try to iron out all the details.
Yeah, we usually reach this time of year anyway, and it's like, all right, we just kind of want it to get here, and I feel like this year a lot of people feel like, all right, let's slow down a little bit. We've got a lot of details we got to iron out before we get to the event, but. Look, let's get to some of these rumors now, some of these reports, and we know who the insiders are, right? We are around the NFL media sphere. We're going to go to Mike Garafolo from the NFL Network, who reported that Brandon Ayuk, the wide receiver from Arizona State, underwent core muscle surgery earlier this week. It's something that he had been dealing with for a few months. Apparently, he ran a 4.5 flat at the combine. Decided to do the surgery now with no OTAs anytime soon. So. To me, we're going to talk about some of these forgotten men in this class. I feel like Brandon Ayuk is a guy that's kind of flying under the radar. Ben, I know you and I talked about him a lot in the fall, especially the second half of the college football season. We were excited to see him, C-Mac, down at the Senior Bowl. He had to pull out late due to an injury, presumably this core muscle deal that he had ended up getting a surgery with, but didn't do a full combine workout. So the shine is kind of worn off a little bit on Ayuk, but that doesn't change what we saw in the fall. C-Mac, what are your thoughts here on the Ayuk news?
I think, Fran, the biggest thing is with the timing so close to the draft, that it makes teams have to be very careful when assessing the risk of where you select them. Now, he was at the combine, so teams or doctors got to see him there. And it was reportedly in Garafal's report done by William Myers, who is one of the more renowned surgeons in that space. So if he were to sign off of it, you would think that most teams would accept it. But, of course, teams are going to want their own information and not really are going to get that probably before the NFL draft. So very interesting strategy to do it now with it being so close to the draft. But I agree, Fran, one of the guys we were hoping to see at the Senior Bowl, and it's disappointing that we didn't get to see him there and get to see that talent along with everyone else on that even playing field.
Yeah, Fran, he ran the 4.5 at the combine. I think he said that was the slowest he's run in like 5 or 10 years or something. So there was something off about that time. He knew there was an injury, obviously, coming off of the Senior Bowl. But I think this is a bigger boom or bust prospect than we consider. He's a one-year player, was stuck behind N'Keal Harry and Kyle Williams at Arizona State, has the injuries. I'm not sure where you take this style of player. I remember falling in love with La Tech's Carlos Henderson a couple years ago. I see a very similar type of player. Now, Henderson had some off-the-field stuff that really stunted his development and getting on the field with the Denver Broncos there. But I think Ayuk has the chance of really being a boom. But there's also some bust potential as well that I don't think we're considering at this time because we get so excited about upside and what they can do for us on Sundays. But I think there's a lot more questions on Ayuk's game than people are considering.
Yeah, I thought ultimately, you talk about the stuff with Henderson. When you look at Ayuk, just going off of what we can go off of on the outside, we see the talent, we see the upside there. I think when you look at even another report here from Adam Kaplan, NFL Insider, reporting that the more coaches he talks to, the more he thinks Ayuk goes in round one. Now, I would say looking at Ayuk, especially with with that report coming on the heels of the announcement of the injury, I wonder if that, exactly what the spin is there. But I think when you look at Ayuk, this is a talented player. And anytime you're dealing with a player that has that kind of small sample size, there's going to be some questions, but there's no questioning the talent at all. I mean, he's got that deep ability, great after the catch. He's well-built kid, used to having the ball in his hands and creating space. So, this is a player that I'm really high on. The only question I have, in terms of Adam's report, how many receivers are going to go round one, guys? I mean, we've talked about this receiver class almost ad nauseum. We're going to talk about it a little bit more here in the later in the segment. But you talk about those top three guys, and you throw in Justin Jefferson, you throw in Jalen Rieger, you throw in an Ayuk. I mean, lots of guys, Laviska Shenault and Denzel Mims. So many of these names have been talked about. KJ Hamler. How many receivers are going to end up going in the first round when it's all said and done?
Well, it's interesting let's go back to Ayuk for a second. If your medical team is confident that he'll be the explosive player that he was and everything checks out, then at the very least, whatever grade you had shouldn't suffer. Now, Kaplan just reported in one of our last episodes, that Jalen Rieger is definitely going to go in round one. So when you look at the list here, you figure there's the top three. However you want to stack them, CeeDee Lamb, Jerry Jeudy, Henry Ruggs. Seems like those three are going. It seems like more and more Justin Jefferson is being put in that, late teens, early 20s area. Yep. Of course, a lot of people have him being mocked to the Philadelphia Eagles. So it seems you can feel pretty comfortable he's going to be the fourth. There are so many names. You mentioned them, Fran, and you go back to recent drafts. 2017, 3 receivers went in the first round. 2018, 2 went in the first round. 2 more went in the 2019 first round. And you go back to 17, all 3 of those players were in the first 9 picks. Corey Davis went to the Titans, Mike Williams to the Chargers, and John Ross to the Bengals. Williams has had a 1,000-yard season, but I don't know if you would say any of them have been elite. And if it's such a deep receiver class, and there's some talented names that we're not even putting in this first-round conversation, our team's going to be more willing to wait, knowing that there's going to be talent to be had in the later rounds. So you don't have to force the receiver pick there in the first round.
I think it's going to be interesting to see how every team decides to play it that way. We talk about playing the draft, and that idea of all right, understanding positional value and understanding how the market's going to play out, with a surplus at wide receivers. I mean, another guy, Adam Kaplan also tweeted out that he thinks USC wide receiver Michael Pittman goes earlier than the media projects. There's just so many names. But at the end of the day, we know that not all these guys are going to work out. So, you're obviously, look, every team is going to feel a certain amount of comfort with each guy. And you might say, okay, we feel comfortable with 10 guys that have, we'll say top 50 type grades. All right, well, then you're taking the gamble that one of those 10 falls to you in the second round if you're a wide receiver needy team and you don't take one in round one. But look, there's plenty of talent to go around, and they all come in different shapes and sizes, Ben, as you know.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to spin this back to another receiver going through some core muscle surgery this offseason, Odell Beckham is going through a similar surgery that Ayuk just elected to have as well. But If you had to tell me 4.5 receivers over under for the first round, I'm probably going under. And I think there's going to be a bump up on quarterbacks, obviously. I think it's bona fide that it's going to be Justin Herbert and Jordan Love squeezing into the first round, obviously. Maybe even another one, like a Jake Fromm late in round one. I think the tackles are going to get pushed up, which I think spins nicely into the next conversation about the next buzz we had heard about Georgia right tackle Isiah Wilson.
Yeah, Daniel Jeremiah reported that Isiah Wilson, he had talked to a few GMs that said on Monday that Wilson's going to go first round. And he said, look, too rich for me, but it's looking like it's going to happen, and teams are betting on the upside. That follows up a report. I think, C-Mac, you brought this up on the show last week from Lance Zierlein reporting that Wilson is polarizing, but is going to go higher than people think. Guys, I'm going to be honest. I watched Isiah Wilson, a big kid, obviously a young kid. He's only a redshirt sophomore. I spoke with him for briefly at the Combine. He's a young kid. I mean, you could see like in terms of like growth potential from an off-field standpoint. Certainly, just a young, youthful personality. I liked being around him, but just a young kid. What do you think of Isiah Wilson going around one?
Well, I think it's interesting, Fran, that he's only a redshirt sophomore. So he's young by class. He's young. He's only been on the field for 2 years at right tackle for Georgia. But the question is, when you have to weigh the tackle class, is who's ready to play? And from what I'm hearing is they think Isiah Wilson is more ready to play than the next tier of tackles. The Ben Barches of the world, the Matt Pertz of the world from UConn, the Shadiq Charleses from LSU. Who's more ready to play at tackle position for your offensive line? And some people think Isiah Wilson is more of a day one ready to play tackle than some of those, round 2 or round 3 tackles. So when you're looking at teams like the Seahawks and the Packers that kind of have needs at tackle there late in round 1, I could absolutely see Josh Jones, Austin Jackson, Isiah Wilson maybe having 6, 7, or 8 tackles going in the first round.
It's interesting to follow up on that, Ben, that he's only played right tackle, but coming out of high school, he was a more touted recruit than his teammate, Andrew Thomas, who's expected to go in the middle of the first round, maybe even, those early teens. So you mentioned he's just 21 years old, very young, above average athlete. There's a tweet from ESPN's Lou Riddick, former front office personnel staff for the Eagles, going to be part of the draft broadcast. He said that the teams with the good offensive line coaches will win this draft. And it's probably when you look at someone like Isiah Wilson, that's the type of guy that they are talking about right there if you're looking for someone to come in and fortify yourself in the trenches.
Yeah, absolutely. He's young. He's moldable. He's raw. I could see an offensive line coach being excited to get their hands on an Isiah Wilson in their offensive line room. He reminds me a little bit of the play presence of Big V coming out of TCU. Now, Isiah Wilson's probably has 20 pounds on Big V, as crazy as that is, because Big V is absolutely massive. I'm glad he got a good free agent contract in Detroit over at Matt Patricia. But has Isiah Wilson reminded you of anybody, Fran? I think Lance Zierlein compared him to Phil Lodeholt, right tackle of the Vikings for a number of years through the 2000s.
Yeah, I mean, that's really what you're kind of dealing with is in terms of just the pure size of this kid. There aren't a lot of guys that have been super high picks that have that kind of a frame. I'm just going through. I mean, he's 6'6.5". He's 350 pounds. To me, like one name I wrote down watching him was, ironically, Eagles offensive lineman Matt Pryor, just because of his size. Like, and the way that he moves. He's not like this, dancing bear athlete, but he obviously for a guy that big, you wouldn't necessarily expect it. But Look, if you're talking about comparing, I forget where I saw this somewhere on Twitter, like comparing Andrew Thomas to Isiah Wilson. To me, it's not close. Like I think Andrew Thomas is a better player, but Isiah Wilson, just because of the size and the upside, the growth potential there, I think you're kind of looking at that and say, okay, there's something more to work with.
Yeah, and just taking a step back, Fran, I'm really happy for the University of Georgia that for some reason has been like a Bermuda Triangle of offensive line talent as far as moving into Sundays in the NFL. Obviously, the prolific running backs, prolific quarterbacks. But when you start to break it down over the last 10 to 15 years, they haven't put a whole lot of offensive linemen into the NFL, surprising as that is because of their offensive success. But this year with Andrew Thomas, left guard, Solomon Kinley, Isiah Wilson at right tackle, I pretty much see all three of them going in the first, 3 or 4 rounds there. So really happy for their offensive line and just getting some more bodies into the NFL.
Well, let's stay with some young guys in the SEC here with this next one. And this also comes from Daniel Jeremiah. And this is about Mississippi State linebacker Willie Gay Jr. He thinks he would be shocked if Willie Gay Jr. goes outside of round 2. Or really said don't be shocked if he goes at the top of round 2. Ben, I know you've done a really deep dive on Willie Gay Jr. What are your thoughts on that report?
Well, I thought the most important part of DJ's report you left out. He said that he's been crushing the interviews.
Yeah, right.
Which everybody knows Willie Gay has got some questions to answer in the interviews. He's got a couple off-the-field things, some academic fraud. He beat up a teammate before the bowl game. He's got some things to answer. I'm not saying everything is malicious or, makes it worthy of him being off people's board. But some off-the-field things to answer. He's obviously a raw player. He only has 800 and something snaps to his name at the University of Mississippi State. But you put on that 2018 game against Alabama, picked off Tua twice. I think he had a big hit on Josh Jacobs all throughout the game. So when he's on the field, you can see the foot speed. You can see the explosiveness. You can see the play presence. Watch his bowl game this past year. I'm blanking on who they played. I think it was Louisville. A receiver's going in the end zone. He hustled, blasted the receiver, forced a fumble. When he's on the field, you see the playmaking potential. You see the play speed. You see the play presence and attitude and personality. The major questions were just the off-the-field stuff. So the fact that DJ squeezed that in and said he's been killing the interviews and doing a great job answering all the questions, that will put Willie Gay into the day 2 conversation. And now it's looking like he's a pretty solid lock to be a round 2 player.
What's going to be very interesting is he has spent his whole life in Starkville, Mississippi. Okay. Born and raised there, grew up there, obviously went to Mississippi State. How will he handle that transition? That's part of the maturity. And again, if you feel good about the off the field stuff and you feel like the coaches can capitalize on that upside, and there's a ton of upside with him because from an athletic testing standpoint, he was second to Isaiah Simmons at the combine. So, and you definitely could see that in the positional workout. So if you feel good about the off field stuff, it certainly makes sense that he'll be an early day 2 selection.
Yeah, and this is a guy when we talked last year about guys like Ed Oliver. When he spent his whole life in the university or in the Houston area. I think when you look at a guy like a Willie Gay Jr., you talk about, okay, is it a bad thing, that he stayed there? It also might be a good thing to get him out of Mississippi State, or out of Starkville as well. So there's 2 ways to kind of look at that. Let's get to the next part of this segment, guys.
Yeah, really quick, Fran. I just want to say, Mississippi State, look at them the past 2 years. Jeffrey Simmons, Montez Sweat, you have Cameron Dantzler, you had the safety Jonathan Abram going to the Raiders in round 1. All these linebackers, Leo Lewis, Willie Gay. What an exciting defense to study and scout. There's talent all over that team, despite their win totals or their success in the SEC. That is a talented group.
They've always done a really good job of churning out quality talent over the last.
And now it's Mike Leach's show down there. So right. Exciting times down there in Starkville.
Well, yeah. So for better or worse, for sure. Let's get to the next segment here, guys, and let's start where we kind of do the same thing we did last week with the NFC East. We're going to scout the scouts here, and I want to start with Denver and John Elway, who's been in there. Now he started as the director of player personnel, has now moved up, obviously, into that general manager role. C-Mac, we'll start with you. Team needs that you saw for the Denver Broncos.
All right, so strong finish down the stretch when Drew Lock took over as starting quarterback, went 4-1 in their final 5 games. A lot of ammo here, 5 picks in the first 2 days of the draft, certainly to help fortify some talent around Drew Lock, and they will need that. My first need is going to be wide receiver. Emmanuel Sanders was traded in the middle of the last season to the 49ers. In his conversations with new offense coordinator Pat Shurmur, Drew Lock says that Shurmur wants to attack downfield. They're going to need some more weapons. So certainly I think wide receiver is at the top of the list. I'm going to go with offensive tackle second here. The interior of the line was improved with the addition of Graham Glasgow at center. They have a couple former first-round picks at tackle right now in Garrett Bowles and Juwan James. But when you look at the contracts beyond 2020, and the fact that the protection for the most part last year struggled until Locke got in there, was able to use his athleticism, I could see tackle being another pressing need to, again, help out your second-year quarterback. I'm going to transition to defense. I think they're going to need to start thinking about life after Von Miller. Yes, they have Bradley Chubb, but if you look from a contract standpoint, Von Miller carries a $22 million cap number in 2021, and the Broncos will have to pull the trigger on that next March. So certainly if they're thinking maybe that it's going to be time to move on, you might want to get your guy in here now and start preparing him for the future. Another interesting note is that the defense with Vic Fangio taking over as head coach started very slow last year with no sacks or turnovers in the first 3 games. They were the first team in 50 years to unfortunately pull off that feat. And I'm going to stick with the defense here for my fourth need. Even though they got A.J. Boye at cornerback, they do have Bryce Callahan, but they redid his deal. There's no guaranteed money in 2021. So I would not be surprised if corner is another position that they try to address at some point here. So to recap there, I'm going to receiver, offensive tackle, edge rusher, and cornerback.
Yeah, I think when you look at this as a team that, I'm glad you highlighted all those needs, C-Mac, because historically, this is a team that typically drafts for need, especially on days 1 and 2. One of the things that I noticed, especially when you're talking early on in the draft, heavy reliance kind of on players that impact the passing game. You look at the players that they've taken: quarterback, a left tackle, 2 edge rushers. They took Bradley Chubb when they already had Von Miller. They had taken Shane Ray a couple years earlier. They took a corner. That's 5 of the 7 first-rounders under John Elway. They also took Noah Fant last year, a pass-catching tight end, and then a defensive tackle in Sly Williams. That was his first ever first-round pick. So since that point, it's all been guys that have had heavy impact on the passing game. And I felt that was kind of an interesting theme to kind of look at. But then after that, I think you look at this group, and overall, heavy reliance on FBS players. 7 years Elway's been drafting. He's taken 1 FCS player that whole time. And not just day 1, not just day 2, throughout the entire draft. 1 FCS player, and he was a transfer from Georgia. That's the corner from Lamar a couple of years ago, Brandon Langley, who they took in the 3rd round. So heavy reliance on guys from the Division I FBS level. Now, that being said, they've also taken a bunch of guys from the group of 5 schools. So we know Power 5, right? SEC, Pac-12, Big Ten, okay, all the big conferences. But they're not afraid to dip outside of that, and they're not afraid to do that early in the draft on days 1 or day 2. I think you look at Paxton Lynch. You look who came out of Memphis. Derek Wolfe out of Cincinnati. Ty Sambrailo was Colorado State. Ronnie Hillman, San Diego State. Ben, you mentioned Carlos Henderson earlier out of La Tech. Kayvon Webster, a corner out of South Florida. So not afraid to go into the group of 5, but they very rarely dip into the FCS level. And then the last thing, heavy lean towards the senior class. 78% of their picks over the last 7 years have been seniors. And there was a quote that I pulled from John Elway after last year's draft. And he was asked about, just drafting a lot of upperclassmen. He said, it worked for us well last year. When you look back at drafts, you always try and figure out what we did well and what didn't go well. I think the concentration, especially the last couple of years, has been on really mature kids that have tremendous background, kids that are willing to go when they come in. They want to be Broncos and are going to work at it. The maturity level has helped. Again, I think the class we have is a very good group. A lot of good leaders in this group too. So that kind of tells you the kind of player from a mental standpoint that they're looking for. So with all that being said, all these highlighted now, Ben, who are some players that you feel kind of fit the mold here, what we're talking about with the Denver Broncos?
Well, I think they really quietly did a great job in free agency in addressing a lot of those needs. Bringing in Melvin Gordon, Darrell Casey, I thought was another great veteran addition there. A.J. Boye. Before free agency, this was one of the more fluid teams that I had no idea what their identity was. And even so, I don't know who their leaders are. I don't know who's going to take this team by the reins and say, this is my team, build around me. Is that Drew Lock? Is that Cortland Sutton? Is that Melvin Gordon and Philip Lindsay and Royce Freeman? Or are you going to start bolstering this offensive line and keep their young quarterback clean? Is it Von Miller? How many years does he have left? This is one of the more fluid, not only narratives, but rosters in the NFL. And there's a lot of different directions they can go. And I think for one of the first times in probably 5 to 6 years in Denver, I don't think they really need to draft for need. And I think they should see where the board kind of falls to them. If an alpha receiver, like a CD Lamb or a Jerry Jeudy falls to them, that's a great pick to mix a Cortland Sutton and give Drew Lock a security blanket receiver. If one of these tackles falls, adding that competition at right tackle or potentially even at left tackle to compete with Garrett Bowles and keep Drew Lock upright and build around the run game with Dalton Risner and some of the other pieces on that offensive line there. I just see literally 10 to 15 different scenarios for the Denver Broncos of taking players, addressing needs, best player available, moving back in the draft, and stockpiling some more day 2 picks to surround Drew Lock with some talent. I know you asked what players, Fran. There's so many different scenarios with this team. I think they're a really unique team to look at.
Yeah, C-Mac, I thought you brought up a great point with the tackle spot, and Ben, you kind of highlighted it as well. Garrett Bowles has not lived up to that first-round price tag. It wouldn't shock me if they decided to go left tackle. I think everybody's been penciling in wide receiver, and certainly that's possible, especially with a team that does draft for need. If one of those top 3 guys did fall to them, certainly that makes sense. But man, the left tackle certainly makes a lot of sense to me too. And if one of those big guys did happen to fall all the way down to 15, I would not be shocked at all if John Elway went that direction. Now, let's go to the team that drafts after the Denver Broncos, and that's the Atlanta Falcons. Thomas Dimitroff, he's been there for a long, long time, so a very wide sample size to look at with him. Now, remember, he came from New England. He was with Bill Belichick there. They first met when they were at Cleveland. So this is a team with Dimitroff that has really warped over the course of the last few years in terms of how they try and attack the draft. They always want to acquire talent, but they're a team that likes to draft for need as well. So, C-Mac, how do you view this team in terms of their needs going into this draft?
Well, 4 ones I selected here, really, really focusing heavy on the defensive side of the football. I'm going to start cornerback. Desmond Trufant was released. They have Isaiah Oliver, former second-round pick, on the one side. Who's going to be the other starting cornerback? They have a couple mid-round selections from last season, Kendall Sheffield, Jordan Miller. But I feel like they're going to look for another premium player there at the cornerback spot. I'm going to say edge. And you might say, but didn't they sign Dante Fowler in free agency? Yes, they did. But Takk McKinley is potentially entering a contract year, and his sack total dipped after 2 productive seasons. Vic Beasley is gone. So I think by helping the pass rush, you're going to be able to help that secondary, that coverage aspect as well. So certainly I think edge rusher could be very much in play as a key need to address. Third, I'm going to stay with the defense, go linebacker, okay? It's a very fast-flowing defense. Deion Jones, a Pro Bowl level there, but can you add another piece there at the second level of the defense? Finally, I'll go offense here, and I'll go with running back, another marquee free agent signing. They're bringing Todd Gurley home, the former, speaking of those Georgia offensive players who have thrived in the NFL. They brought him home on a 1-year deal, but Devontae Freeman is still out there on the free agency market. Can you really count on Todd Gurley's health? A complementary piece, I think, would help what is otherwise a very good offense. So, Atlanta Falcons, I'm going to go cornerback, edge rusher, linebacker, and running back as my 4 top needs.
So when I, kind of looked at this team and said, like, all right, what are some of the trends we've seen? Number one, they're very active, going up, going down. They're not afraid to move from what their spot is in the NFL draft. And I know Thomas Dimitroff, and speaking to the media a couple weeks ago, kind of hinted like, this could be a year when we move. So don't be shocked if you see them move out of that 15 hole. On both sides of the ball, they value competitive toughness. They always talk about that when they acquire players. They'll use terms like energy and urgency and toughness and passion and swagger all the time when they're talking about guys that they draft in those post-draft press conferences. So you want guys that kind of fit that kind of mindset, that kind of play personality. And then while toughness is important, they also want really athletic guys. They love sideline-to-sideline players on defense. They value athleticism at wide receiver. They value it at running back. They value it on the O-line. That's a very, very important trait for them is athleticism. So you want tough, competitive guys who also pass certain athletic thresholds. So, Ben, with that in mind, there are certainly a handful of players that kind of fit in terms of need and personality and athletic thresholds for this Atlanta Falcons team going into a couple weeks from now.
I also feel like this is one of the more fluid conversations with not only a positional need, but a scheme-specific need coming from that single-high Seattle Dan Quinn defense there and projecting who that corner is going to be, whether they feel Isaiah Oliver can be that guy or finding who's going to be the next Desmond Trufant. A lot of people have pegged C.J. Henderson into there, but I see more people thinking they'd rather an off-bail corner like a Christian Fulton or somebody with some more length on the edge there. So addressing the needs is an interesting conversation, but also being a scheme-specific player for that defense and Dan Quinn is also part of the equation and trying to find somebody that fits what they're looking for at corner, which those types of defenses that Seattle single high has a type that they like out there.
Yeah, I mean, 32 inches seems to have been the benchmark for those Pete Carroll-type coaches, right, in terms of length at the cornerback spot. C.J. Henderson is just over 31.5, so a little bit below that benchmark. But one guy who does fit is Trayvon Diggs. I wonder if they maybe move back and they get a Trayvon Diggs. Kayvon Chasen, the pass rusher from LSU. I mean, guys, that kind of fits the mindset, right? He's a tough kid, competitive, athletic. He's young. That's it. It certainly fits a need. That's certainly one that kind of fits. We've talked about a little bit about that connection there. Anybody else between you guys that you feel could kind of fit the bill for the Atlanta Falcons?
I think they should find a defensive tackle an edge player that could also slide into defensive tackle. I feel like they've had too many segmented bodies over the years, too many designated edge, designated interior. I'd like to find somebody with some more versatility. And I think early in the process, we were looking at the A.J. Epenesas of the world that are more the stout edge setters on early downs that could kick in at 3-tech and some sub packages. But it seems like he's kind of fallen later in the first round as he really doesn't look the part and didn't test well in Indy. But I would like to see Atlanta come with some more versatility in their trench players.
For me, it's just fascinating because this was such a Jekyll and Hyde team last year where the only win in the first half of the season before their bye week was against the Eagles in week 2. Then they rallied down the stretch, go 6-2, and they ended up finishing, believe it or not, they finished second place in the division, but the talk during the bye week was whether or not Dan Quinn was even going to survive the season. And they had some monumental wins over teams like the Niners and the Saints in that run. So just very interesting how they were able to turn it on at the end of the year, but definitely seems like they have to fix the defense, especially with a defensive-minded head coach. Even though he may say, I'm going to get the most out of the talent, the defense definitely seemed to be the Achilles heel and definitely improved much more. They'd had some coaching changes there among the assistants on that staff that definitely, I think, helped spur the defense down the stretch there.
Well, that was great stuff, guys. Really, really appreciate you guys digging into both those teams, the Denver Broncos and the Atlanta Falcons. Hope all of you guys out there enjoyed that conversation. Now let's move into some position previews here. We've done it over the last few weeks. Next, we're going to do the wide receiver position in our first category, best hands. C-Mac, we're going to go with you with the best hands of day one wide receivers.
I feel like you're underselling this. This is the one I feel like fans have probably been waiting for the most, I would say, out there. So superlatives, the best hands wide receiver edition for the day one players. I went with Justin Jefferson out LSU. Yes, he did have 111 receptions, tied for the FBS lead with James Prochet of SMU, but he did average 14.6 yards per catch. We're not talking, easy screens. He can track the deep ball. He could work out of the slot. He was fearless in the middle. He's able to keep his focus and thought he was great in the gauntlet drill at the combine. Very good positional work out there. So for best hands, I went with Justin Jefferson of LSU.
Ben, who you got for day two?
So I'm going to go with a guy who I think should be getting so much more buzz. A guy with 104 catches, productive, runs a 4.39 track background. That's Devin Duvernay, who is behind Justin Jefferson in pretty much every slot category, which I don't think is fair because Justin Jefferson had a couple extra games with that national title game and the playoff run there. But when you look at that 104 catches, only 3 drops this past year. And he's my vote for the best junk ball catcher in this class of receivers. And when I say junk ball, that means being able to adjust the passes, going down low by your ankles, opening up your hip to passes thrown behind you, working the sideline, having corners on your back. This guy is going to be a quarterback's best friend in his 68 first down receptions, second to Justin Jefferson. This guy's going to be an absolute first down chain mover in the NFL. I see him very much like a Hines Ward type of player. I don't think he'll have that type of presence and personality on the field, but how he was used and just being that quarterback's best friend, Devin Duvernay, great player.
Yeah, I love the junk ball reference. I don't think I've ever heard that in terms of football before. I like bringing that to the vernacular.
So I heard that before. I think it was in the Do Your Job documentary. Josh McDaniels talked about Danny Amendola, and it was a certain play, and they needed their best junk ball catcher. And I'm not sure what the circumstance was. It might have been a quick little sit route in front of the goal line, and you knew it was going to be hard and low and in traffic. But I've always liked that term and just being able to catch, for lack of a better word, junk passes.
Yeah, I've always been a Duvernay fan going back to the summer, and I'm glad you brought the Hines Ward comparison. I kind of like that. His physicality, his toughness, gets kind of undersold a little bit. But I've been a big fan of Devin Duvernay. For me, day 3, best hands. I was torn, guys. I think my gut says KJ Hill from Ohio State. We've seen him make some outstanding catches, one-handed grabs down the field, all 3 areas of the field. He made some great catches down in Mobile at the Senior Bowl. This is a guy that's got outstanding focus at the catch point, has the ability to track a ball over his shoulder. I'm a big fan of KJ Hill. Very easily could sneak into the back of day 3 or of round 3, but I think it's likely in this receiver class that he could go early day 3. Another guy I would throw in there would be Antonio Gandy Golden as well. Different body types here, but Gandy Golden really has got maximizes that wingspan, can go up and make plays at the catch point. A really, really impressive player over the course of his career at Liberty. All right, next category here: best technician. C-Mac, day 1.
I'm going to go with Jerry Jeudy out of Alabama, 2-time first-team All-American in terms of the accolades, lines up all over the formation, can run the route tree, smooth in his transitions, knows how to change up the speed to throw defensive backs off. So, when you're looking at those guys, CeeDee Lamb, Jerry Jeudy, I went with Jeudy on this one for best technician.
Well, Fran, going best technician, I think this is an easy slam dunk pick because, it was a guy that was being worked on his releases and stems and getting out of his breaks, probably in diapers, being the son of Sean Jefferson. And that's Van Jefferson, the receiver out of Ole Miss, who is the transfer from the University of Florida. Oh, no, switch that around, was the Ole Miss transfer that went to University of Florida. But he's a guy that knows how to attack leverages, set up defensive backs, a variety of releases and route stems. A guy that didn't test particularly well, but that's okay. You can be a 4-6 receiver if you know how to get yourself open. And when I talk about technicians, that's Van Jefferson to a T.
So for me, I went with James Prochet, the slot receiver from SMU. Extremely productive this year. Really sharp, crisp route runner, but also really good defeating press coverage as well. Now, I did it at a lower level of competition, but when I look at James Prochet, this is a guy who understands how to get open. A lot of the things you just said about Van Jefferson, I think, apply as well to James Prochet, Ben. Really, really impressive player that I like a lot on film. And I would also throw Kalijah Lipscomb in there as well. Not going to impress you athletically. Remember, was coached by Eagles wide receivers coach Aaron Moorhead down at Vanderbilt. Lipscomb knows what he's doing as a route runner, and he's able to get off the line as well, despite some limitations from a physical standpoint. So next category here, best yards after catch receiver. C-Mac, we'll go to you for day 1.
We've talked about him in the show already. I went with Brandon Ayuk, Arizona State. Once you give him the ball in his hands, he's gone. 18.3 yards per catch. And a more impressive number, 11.1 yards after the catch last season. And he has outstanding returner experience, and that ability to separate shows there as well. So for best yak, I went with Brandon Ayuk, someone who we've already talked about on the program.
11.1 is good, C-Mac, but I got you beat because my guy's got 11.7 and led the country with a minimum of 50 targets. And that's Antonio Gibson at the University of Memphis. He doesn't look like a receiver, being 6 foot, nearly 230 pounds, running a 4.39. He really looks a little bit closer to A.J. Brown than I think we're all considering. But Antonio Gibson played in the slot about 80% of the time. A lot of manufactured touches on some swing passes, some screens, RPO stuff, 11.7 average yards after catch per reception. That led the country with a minimum of 50 targets. So a guy that's been productive, but just doesn't look the part of a normal receiver.
Yeah, I love that. That's Gibson is a guy that is really is very intriguing with his skill set, and obviously a big play waiting to happen, no matter how he's used, offense or special teams. I would say the same thing about Joe Reed. You know, Ben, you brought him up a couple of weeks ago. I watched him back in the fall. Joe Reed reminds me, Ben. I think I mentioned this to you after you watched him. Reminds me of former Eagle Josh Huff. You know, he's got that same kind of a build. Can be used as a back. He can be used as a receiver. Quality kick returner as well over the course of his career with the Cavaliers. He's great with the ball in his hands. He's got some long speed. I like Joe Reed. He's a guy that really, to me, is flying under the radar in this class. The last category for us, guys, highest upside at the wide receiver position. We're going to start day one, and we're going to start with C-Mac.
So I contemplated putting Denzel Mims here for the blend of size and athleticism, but I ultimately decided to go with Henry Ruggs of Alabama. 4.27 in the 40, an absolute speed demon, top-level athlete, game-breaking ability, was a touchdown machine at Alabama, 24 touchdowns in 3 seasons on just 98 receptions. He's only 21 years old. Certainly, whichever offensive coordinator who gets him is going to have a ton of fun with this toy. So for highest upside, I went with Henry Ruggs.
The upside, the floor, the ceiling conversations are always interesting in my opinion because everybody has different interpretations. But in order to have some upside, that means you had to have left us a little bit to be desired in college. And when you go back to that 2017 recruiting class with Henry Ruggs and Devonta Smith and Jerry Jeudy and T. Higgins, you know who was the number 1 in the class? How about Donovan Peoples-Jones? But he just never lived up to it at the University of Michigan. Obviously, some quarterback issues, had some injuries here and there. He also came in with Tariq Black, so there was a lot of bodies and mouths to feed in that offense there. But you show up to the combine and run 4.48, jump 44.5 inches in the vert, broad 11.7. I think consensus top 5 performance in Indy, right behind, you know, Isaiah Simmons and all those freak shows there. But a guy that just hasn't been able to produce. He's a good punt returner. He's been in the slot about half the time. He has tons of talent, tons of ability, tons of pedigree, just never really refined his game there at the University of Michigan. I wish he had a couple extra years with Josh Gaddis, who came from the University of Alabama, previously Penn State, great receivers coach there, now the offensive coordinator. But a guy with a lot of talent, but I think much more room to grow on Sundays.
Yeah, when I talk about upside, I like, talk about it in a way of guys that I feel can outperform their draft slot. One guy that I feel like has that ability is John Hightower, the speedster out of Boise State, has the ability to stretch the field, can be a big play weapon in the passing game, has some special teams potential as well. We got to see him up close down at the East-West Shrine Bowl in January, C-Mac. He made some plays down there, especially late in the week in practice. So I look at John Hightower with his speed. I think when you look at the speed receivers in this class, the true speed guys, look at Henry Ruggs, you look at KJ Hamler, and then there's a little bit of a drop, and you wonder, all right, who's the next guy? And to me, it might be Hightower. From a numbers standpoint, I think it's probably going to fall to the third day of the draft, but that does not discount the ability and the jets on that kid. He's got the ability to stretch the field. All right, let's put the receivers to bed. Last one here, we're going to do the linebacker spot. We're not going to do edge rusher, not pass rusher, but off-ball stack linebackers and best coverage player, because we know how important the pass game is. C-Mac, best coverage player at the linebacker spot on day one.
I went with Patrick Queen of LSU. Just so fluid, so agile and rangy. Heat-seeking missile. It's so much fun. You go back to the championship game, watching them take out running backs in the pass game. Can cover sideline to sideline. So I went with Patrick Queen. I was getting a lot of buzz there for being that late first round selection there.
Yeah, that's a good pick there, C-Mac. So great instincts against screen passes. Had a good pick against Tua as well this season down the field. My coverage player, who's one of the more polarizing conversations because of his injuries, is Marcus Bailey at the University of Purdue. 2 ACL injuries, looks to be 100%. I've seen his agent and some other people put out some workout videos, but 6 career interceptions, 6 PBUs, a guy that can turn and run, can play with his back to the quarterback and find the ball in the air, has some savviness and screens and going sideline to sideline and working through the junk there. So a guy that's shown a little bit more in the pass game than we've seen some of these off-ball linebackers.
my guy has a chance to go day 2 just because of the upside here. But when you talk about track athletes at the linebacker spot, those are typically few and far between when you're talking about sprinters, and especially at the college level. Davion Taylor was that guy for Colorado. Did not play much high school football. Didn't really play any games in high school. Didn't play football until his junior college days. Could only practice during high school due to religious reasons. So didn't really get to play in any games until the college level. Transfers up to Colorado, becomes a 2-year starter for them. Davion Taylor, really, really impressive athlete. He's got the ability to move in every direction that he wants. Really, really impressive ease of movement. This is a guy with really high upside that could go higher than day 3, but to me, most impressive coverage upside in this class at the linebacker spot on the back end of the draft. All right, let's go to the next one here. Best run defender, C-Mac. We're going to you day 1.
So this is not going to be the top of the list, the top priority, okay, for these linebackers because of the way offenses are in the league. But, Fran, you and I saw this player at the Combine, and he certainly looks the part. We're talking about Kenneth Murray from Oklahoma. You go back into his stats, he had 28 tackles in a single game against Army during his career with the Sooners. Very, very impressive. Has been ascending in this draft, but someone who certainly has the ability to run and chase, not going to be a liability in the run game for you. So while it's not going to be the most important facet, I went with Kenneth Murray of Oklahoma for best run defender.
All right, I couldn't decide here, Fran, so I'm going with 2. I hope I stole one of yours. All right, 2 guys in completely different packages. So you got Jordan Brooks, 20 tackles for loss, but he's only 5'11". He's a bit of a stump. You don't normally see those type of linebackers anymore, that Curtis Lofton, Jonathan Vilma type of mold. But this guy makes a lot of tackles in the run game. But I couldn't leave Malik Harrison off this list. This is a big, bruising, physical linebacker at 6'3", nearly 250 pounds. That is no problem fighting for himself and fighting off blocks and taking on guards and centers and tackles in the tackle box. A guy that's probably going to play off the edge on third down and some sub packages, but when we're talking first and second down, stopping the run, that's what Malik Harrison does first and foremost.
Well, I'm glad you brought up Jordan Brooks, because that was actually a name I actually meant to include this in Draft Buzz. C-Mac, you sent over an article from Jason Lockenfora, I believe, with 4 guys who could surprise with their round 1 appearance. And Jordan Brooks from Texas A&M, or Texas Tech rather, was one of those guys, saying that there's been chatter about him. Jeremy Chin from Southern Illinois on that list. And then also Terrell Lewis, the pass rusher from Alabama, and Marlon Davidson, the defensive lineman from Auburn. So a few names there from Jason Lockenfora, who, by the way, is really, really good at this in terms of giving that late, giving us on the outside some late news to somebody who could appear in round 1. All those guys we've heard some buzz about, but Jordan Brooks haven't heard as much about. So I'm glad you brought him up there, Ben, in terms of a day 2 selection. I'm going to go with Evan Weaver, a guy, when you talk about the senior class, there are questions about his athleticism, his ability to play sideline to sideline, but this kid's tough. He's instinctive, form tackler, technically sound, can play in traffic. You mentioned junk ball receivers earlier. He's a junk ball run defender in terms of his ability to play in traffic, find the football. Evan Weaver does a lot really, really well in that area of the game between the hashes. So that's my pick there for best run defender. Weaver now gets the most instinctive linebacker in this class. Now, we're going to start with day 1. C-Mac, we'll start with you.
So for instinctive, it's a little bit of a projection here because this player was more of an edge rusher, although he had some dropping responsibilities at Wisconsin. I'm talking about Zach Bond, who's gaining a lot of steam as a late first-round selection. Most analysts are projecting him to play off-ball linebacker in the NFL, but with his ability to understand leverage, how to play off the edge, I felt that he'd be a good fit for this superlative as most instinctive.
Yeah, Fran, my most instinctive is a guy that makes a lot of plays but doesn't have a whole lot of redeeming physical qualities. So the only way to do that is to be instinctive. And that's Troy Dye at the University of Oregon, who's played a lot of good ball up there. I was concerned about his size going into the season. He weighed at 218 in the summer and then shows up to the combine at 231. So a guy that put on some weight, looks like he can really contribute on third downs. He never came off the field and always just seemed like he was a tick ahead of the offensive game plan because of his instincts. And a guy without a lot of redeeming qualities as far as athleticism and explosiveness, but makes a lot of plays and gets in position because of those instincts and the football IQ.
You know, and I'm so glad that you presented it that way, Ben, because I wanted to say a lot of the same things about my pick, and that's Dante Olsen, the linebacker from Montana, 2-year starter out there for the Grizzlies. But when you look at this kid, was extremely productive, won the Buck Buchanan Award as the FCS Defensive Player of the Year this past year, broke his own school record, had 179 tackles this past year. Really instinctive kid, has a special teams background. He only ran 4.8, out at the combine, and that's going to hurt him. But the other tests were actually pretty good, and I thought he had a solid positional workout as well, C-Mac. So I think when you look at Dante Olsen, this is a guy, productive, special teams background. He's tough. He's instinctive. You just worry about the range. You worry about the long speed, and that's really the big thing you got to worry about with Dante Olsen. But from a mental standpoint, it's all there. All right, let's go to the last category here. Most versatile player, C-Mac at linebacker, day one. Who you got?
This was the easiest one. Isiah Simmons of Clemson. He pretty much is considered the modern day defensive player in the NFL. Just an absolute freak show athlete. Plays linebacker, safety, can rush, can cover, can do it all there in the last 2 levels of the defense. So it's understandable to see why he's going to be a top 5 selection in this draft class, most likely. So I went with Isiah Simmons out of Clemson as the most versatile.
You know, Fran, I went up and down my linebacker list trying to find a player I had in mind here. Could not find him, and then realized, oh, yeah, he's in the safety category, but he was a linebacker at the combine. And that's Kaliki Hudson out of Michigan. Another guy that I think has more upside in the NFL, high recruit, really, really productive year in 2017. I would implore anybody to go look at his tape or at least look at his stat line because he loaded it up in every category, sacks, TFLs, picks, PBUs. It was literally like a honey badger type of stat line for an entire season. And they just never really lived up to it in Don Brown's defense the past 2 years. But I think a guy that can play in the box, has played a lot of snaps in the box for Don Brown, but can also match up on some tight ends, can play on the back end. I really see like a Patrick Chung type of player that's going to be in this league for a long time.
Yeah, no, this is a guy that obviously, has that versatile skill set. And, I could have gone with Davion Taylor for my pick for day 3. Obviously, I talked about him a couple of minutes ago in terms of best coverage player. I went with guys that have length and athleticism and some position versatility. Cam Brown from Penn State, Michael Walker from Fresno State. I think both those guys have similar kinds of body types, could be used in some different ways. They both have some similarities to me, to a Devondre Campbell coming out of Minnesota in terms of the frame and the movement and the range. Both guys, I think, still have some things to do from a mental standpoint, but I think they both present that versatility that we're talking about going into today's game. All right, let's go now into our mock draft roundup. Dale Jeremiah from NFL Network dropped his most recent mock. He's got the Eagles taking linebacker Kenneth Murray, staying at the linebacker spot. C-Mac, you talked about Kenneth Murray a little bit ago. What are your guys' thoughts on Kenneth Murray in the 21 hole to the Eagles?
Well, I'll say this. This offseason to this point has been all about the defense. So the final piece that they have not acquired is a cornerstone linebacker. And that's why, to me, if they feel like they want to infuse all this youth, all this talent on that side of the ball, why not go all the way and add someone like Kenneth Murray, who was a team captain at Oklahoma as well?
Well, a lot of that's going to be the positional value. And if they don't see that linebacker on day 2 and a huge drop-off, they better go get him in round 1 because I think there's more comparable receiver talent in rounds 2 and round 3 that if they're considering a Justin Jefferson, you can maybe sit on that position and then go get a Jalen Reagor or a Duvernay or maybe even a T. Higgins on day 2. And I think that's a lot of the conversation. But having a Kenneth Murray on the second level of the defense there is a big imposing presence that can make a lot of plays in the tackle box, out to the alleys, to the sideline. A guy that hasn't turned and run a whole lot in his college career, but not something we ask our linebackers to do quite often in Philadelphia. A guy will probably be down on the line of scrimmage in some sub packages, a lot like the way Nigel Bradham was used the past 3 and 4 years. But Kenneth Murray's a really good player, a huge, massive, imposing presence that I think would really improve any defense in the NFL.
Well, how does Kenneth Murray fall to 21? Let's look at the 5 picks before the Eagles here. Atlanta at 16, cornerback C.J. Henderson. Based off our earlier discussion, I think that pick makes a lot of sense. Dallas at 17, K'Lavon Chasen, the pass rusher from LSU. Based off our conversation last week, I think that makes a lot of sense. Then you go to the Miami Dolphins at 18, Yetur Gross-Matos. The Las Vegas Raiders at 19, taking A.J. Terrell. And the Jacksonville Jaguars at 20, taking wide receiver Justin Jefferson. Now, the big takeaway for me, leading up to the Eagles, the top 3 receivers, Lamb, Judy, Ruggs, went off the board in that order at picks 11, 12, and 13. So before the top 15 selections were done, all 3 of those top wideouts were off the board.
To me, this is just a very interesting scenario. And Fran, when you sent this to me yesterday, this is the thing I slacked over to you was this is a very intriguing position that I would wonder what the Eagles would do here, because top 4 receivers are off the board if you were thinking receiver. 3 cornerbacks are off the board. 3 edge rushers are off the board. You know, some of those positions that the Eagles, you know, and Dave Spadaro did a great column of tracking the last 10 years of first round and top draft picks for the Eagles and which positions they value. So definitely make sure you go read that. It seems like to me this would be a very, very intriguing position here for the Eagles if this is how the board were to fall in 2 weeks.
Yeah, it's certainly an interesting way for the board to fall. We'll just go to the 5 picks after the Eagles. Minnesota at 22, taking Jaylen Johnson. I really like that fit there in Minnesota. New England at 23, taking A.J. Epinesa. New Orleans at 24, taking Patrick Queen. So the mock draft we looked at last week with Todd McShay had Kenneth Murray going to New Orleans and Patrick Queen going to the Eagles. Those 2 flip-flop here for DJ. Minnesota at 25, taking T. Higgins, the wide receiver from Clemson. And Miami taking Josh Jones. A.J. Epinesa quickly becoming a popular pick there in mock drafts for the New England Patriots.
I think he's a really good player, and I don't care that he looks like a refrigerator or ran 5 seconds. This guy doesn't have to come off the field. He's going to hunt quarterbacks on 3rd down. He's a technical player that could win through you, inside of you, outside of you. I don't care the way he looks or tested. This is a good football player anytime he was on the field, and if you're going to let him fall to a New England Patriots, they're going to make you pay, just like Belichick has with some of these other late-round steals.
To me, Jaylen Johnson seems to be picking up steam as a consistent option here late in the first round of mock drafts. So definitely looking at the risers late in the process, it seems like Jaylen Johnson would fit into that category.
Yeah, and Fran, I don't think we're also realizing how big of a drop-off there is from edge rushers. I mean, we obviously know Chase Young and Chasen, and now we're hearing maybe Terrell Lewis squeezing in there. But after that, where do you go off the edge there? Because it's that big drop-off to getting into the Josh Uches of the world and some guys with some more positional questions and some scheme questions and things like that, maybe some of these edge rushers get bumped up because there's a big drop off. I'm not sure what edge rushers are going to go on day 2.
Yeah, it's going to be that's a really interesting conversation. And I think when you look at the terms of which positions have the most depth, I would say pass rusher probably towards the bottom of the list in this draft. We haven't really talked too much about Jaylen Johnson. I finished up my report on Johnson last week, Ben. I think I texted you afterwards. A guy I wrote down was Prince Amukamara, who, maybe hasn't lived up to, I think he went in the teens somewhere to the New York Giants, but he's been a solid pro and a solid starter now in the league for a long time.
Yeah, and a really good defense, too, with a lot of NFL caliber talent around him, which, I think prepares him as well just to have that type of speed and reliability from his safeties and the linebacker play in front of him. But a guy that's battled some really good receivers in the Pac-12 the past couple years, and that Utah defense has just been pumping out really good NFL players. So I do not see a surprise at all if Jaylen Johnson goes in the first round.
All right, guys, let's wrap this up now. No more draft buzz. Let's get now into pick 6.
Now it's time for pick 6.
All right, so I teased it at the top of the show. 6 players who are flying under the radar for the top 50 selections in this draft. Basically, guys that had some buzz towards the end of the college football season, but that buzz has kind of waned as of late. And I'm going to just start us off here with a guy that we talked about at the top of the show, and that's Brandon Ayuk. We talked about him in the fall. He kind of burst onto the scene. It was his first year as a starter, kind of taking over for N'Keal Harry in that Arizona State offense. Came on like gangbusters, was really, really productive throughout the course of the college football season. got the invite to the Senior Bowl, couldn't participate, was a late scratch from the game, failed the physical down there in Mobile, wasn't a full participant out in the at the combine, ran a little bit slower than a 40 than people expected, and now has the surgery. So Brandon Ayuk is a guy, to me, not getting a lot of buzz, but that doesn't take away from the talent that this guy has. Certainly a really, really intriguing player on film.
Yeah, why don't you go ahead, C-Mac?
I will go with a player who was a second-team All-American in 2018. Suffered a really serious ankle injury, missed the second half of this past season. I don't know if he was going to be a top 50 player when all is said and done, but if you were looking at mocks in the fall, this player was, I think, projected by most to be a late first-round consideration. That's Bryce Hall out of Virginia. Big size. He's just someone, when you talk about who hasn't generated any juice, I feel like you haven't heard his name at all in the pre-draft conversations for someone who had such a productive 2018 campaign and was coming in with a lot of steam into 2019. So shame that he suffered the injury. All accounts seem to be that, top-notch character, team captain, but just intriguing that even though that you've heard about other injured players in this process, I feel like you haven't heard his name mentioned whatsoever in this process. Maybe it's because some of the other corners are risers, talking about guys like Jaylen Johnson, but just very, very intriguing that you haven't heard his name whatsoever here.
Yeah, that's a great call there, C-Mac. And anytime you have a season-ending injury, typically your buzz goes with it. But you put on his 2018 tape, I think he had a legitimate 20 pass breakups last year. So put enough on tape to to definitely see his upside there. But as we're going through this, evolving conversation of the tackle class and talking about Isiah Wilson's and where does Austin Jackson fit in and things like that, I feel like Josh Jones at the University of Houston has completely been overlooked with this class. A guy that allowed 4 pressures all season long, not 4 sacks, 4 pressures. And a guy that's been working with Paul Alexander, former offensive line coach, who's compared to Walter Jones. Anytime an NFL offensive line coach compares you to Walter Jones, that should be a red flag and an asterisk to everybody that you should go back and rewatch his tape and then go put him on at the Senior Bowl. He's done everything right he's been asked to do. His conversation and buzz is just a little bit lacking right now, but a really good player that I think needs more mid-first round conversation.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I think Josh Jones, a really, really intriguing player that is currently flying under the radar because of all those junior offensive linemen. My second guy here, guys, Darrell Taylor, pass rusher, Tennessee, was kind of a strong side linebacker coming into the year. I was really, really high on Taylor. Ben, you and I have had lots of spirited discussions about him going back to as early as July and August of last year, talked about him through September and October. The production never really quite matched it. We were excited to see him down at the Senior Bowl. Like Ayuk, C-Mac, we got down there to Mobile. Taylor was a late scratch for the event, so did not participate, did not get a combine workout either. But Taylor's a guy I feel like could go earlier than people are, for the most part, are talking about him overall in this class. I think he's got a really well-rounded skill set. We talked about the lack of depth at pass rusher. I feel like he's a guy that could go earlier because he's got some of those traits that teams look for.
Now, not to bring up another injured player here, but wide receiver, again, the depth there. We talked about the 10 possible names that could go in the first round, and a player who early in the draft process, back Senior Bowl time, was considered a late first round selection, someone who was mocked to the Eagles numerous times, and that's Laviska Shenault out of Colorado. And obviously the medical playing a big role in this. Slow time of the combine, underwent core muscle surgery, number of injuries at Colorado that teams are going to have to account for. And again, with the lack of pro day and lack of pre-draft visits, that's going to be much more tougher to do. But he was someone whose name was in that conversation among the top receivers in this class. And because of the injury and because of how some of these other players like Justin Jefferson and Mims have come on, it seems like Chenault's name has kind of been lost there. But still, he's still on DJ's top 50 board, still on most, at least in the top 50. It's just going to be intriguing. How far does he slide because of the medical?
Yeah, that's a great call there, C-Mac. And, I don't know if these are really first-round players or maybe even day 2 players, but guys I just really haven't heard their name but are productive players, are good on the field, off the field. Some running backs just getting caught in the wash here, like a LaMichael Pirine at Florida or Keyshawn Vaughn at Vanderbilt. 2 SEC running backs that can contribute in the pass game, that are every down players, have good speed, good size, good kids off the field. I just feel like these are some guys doing everything right. They just get caught in the wash a little bit with the conversation, and maybe they don't have the upside of a Cam Akers or the juice of a Darrington Evans at App State. But these are guys that are going to ho-hum their way to 10, 12 years in the NFL, like a Thomas Jones, and you're not going to think twice about it, when we look back on their draft trajectory.
No, good stuff there, guys. Really good insight there on some of the guys that are kind of flying under the radar right now, just a couple weeks away from April's draft. All right, let's now get into the next part of our show, the last part of our show. It's time for Draft Mailbag.
Now it's time to hear from you, the fans, in the Draft Mailbag.
So the best way to help us out here on the Journey to the Draft podcast, driven by AAA, go on to Apple Podcasts or Stitcher, leave us a rating, leave us a comment. It's the best way to boost it up the rankings. The draft is just a couple weeks away. We want this to be available to as many people as possible. So help us out here and go check us out on Apple Podcasts. Leave a review. If you leave a question, we will answer it. So that's what we're going to do here for a couple of people. We're going to start with River DTD, left a 5-star review saying, love the podcast. What about wide receiver Marquez Callaway from Tennessee in the 5th round for the Eagles? He made a lot of big plays for a mediocre team that did not have consistent quarterback play over his time there. I think he could be a sleeper in a loaded receiver draft. What do you think? I love him as a day 3 pick. Ben, you saw Callaway up close, and you've talked a lot of times about how, guys that play on teams that don't have a lot of success typically get misevaluated. Do you feel that Callaway could kind of fit into that boat?
Callaway has a lot of juice and a lot of buzz building behind the scenes with scouts as maybe being a day 3 option that can just fly. And just like the way Darius Slayton contributed to the New York Giants being a 6th round or 5th round pick at Ole Miss there, but just being a straight burner, Marquez Callaway can contribute in special teams, being a returner. He could probably be a gunner for you. And what can he do waking up in the morning? Run 4-3, 4-4, and take the top off the defense. And there's always going to be a value and a place for that style of player. And when you're really breaking down Marquez Callaway and Jawan Jennings and Darrell Taylor and Nigel Warrior, that University of Tennessee has some talent, and you typically don't get your way into the SEC like that, not being a talented player. So like you were saying, they may not have the win totals, but there's some talented players on that team.
I think that the big thing is the punt return experience. Okay, right there alone, you're looking for an elite trait. 3 punt return touchdowns in college, was a 2nd-team All-SEC in that regard. So certainly could see a team looking to upgrade that 3rd phase, looking at someone like Callaway on day 3.
Hey, do you guys remember Marcus Johnson that we traded to the Seahawks a couple years ago? I think it's that type of presence. I think a little bit more value as a returner, but we knew what Marcus Johnson did really well. He started and he stopped. He was kind of a linear, vertical plane receiver, but that has a value in the NFL.
Let's get to the next one here. Good stuff there on Callaway. Ed Media left a 5-star review saying, love the podcast. As a sports talk host, this content is helpful. What role do position coaches have in scouting prospects? In addition to conducting drills with prospects, how much does their feedback influence who teams select? And if a position coach or a unit coach prefers a player they scout or player evaluator doesn't, how do teams decide which way to go? Great question. Deep question. And every team, and I want you guys to chime in here, every team handles this a little bit differently, and we don't on the outside necessarily know exactly how much it's valued one way or the other. But I will say coaches come in a little bit late because, remember, after the season ends, they have to do self-scouting on their own team. You got to deal with free agency. There's a lot that you have to get to before you get to the NFL draft and those prospects at their specific positions. Sometimes they'll start around Senior Bowl time. Sometimes they won't get to see a guy up until the week before the combine. And so the player evaluation starts for those guys a little bit later in the process. But once you meet those guys, look, what a lot of general managers will do is say, all right, look, here is how we stack the board at pass rusher or at defensive tackle or at corner. Here's how we stack it. Watch all these guys. Rank all the guys in specific tiers for us. So, hey, we have these 3 bunched together. We have these 4 guys bunched together. Rank those 3, rank those 4, rank these 5, and let us know what your feedback is. Some people do it that way. Some people have a little bit more leash and are able to give more detailed and more, get a little bit more influence in terms of their evaluation. So Guys, what are your thoughts there in terms of the coaches and their impact on the evaluation and the pick process in the draft?
I mean, I've heard every type of involvement from position coaches, from listen, you'll coach whoever we give you, we don't want your input, to they've literally been tied in with the scouting department and they're watching kids, writing reports, interviewing them, working them out. So like you were saying, Fran, every team is different because each situation is going to be different. Sometimes you're a first-year receiver coach fresh out of college. You might have more input and opinion on the kids than some of the scouts who've been watching them. Or you could be a 10-year NFL receiver coach and you haven't watched a snap of college football in 20 years. I've heard of those guys too. So, I think every team and every makeup and each positional coach probably has a different pedigree and involvement there. But I think having a good marriage with your personnel department, your scouting department, your coaching staff, and making sure everybody's on the same page and understanding what meal are you trying to cook. And then you could get the proper ingredients for the meal. It's when you don't know what you're serving at the end of the day that all of a sudden you get all different ingredients, and then you're making a hodgepodge, and it's just a mud pie there. So I think having a good involvement from every layer of your building is really the name of the game and part of the puzzle in winning a championship.
No one wants mud pie. No one wants mud pie, to be clear.
Just to add to that piece you said about Ben, about how college coaches might have more insight. Jeff Stoutland was hired in 2013 as the Eagles offensive line coach. Eagles had the number 4 overall selection that year. Jeff Stoutland was told, find us our offensive lineman of the future. And he wanted Lane Johnson. Lane Johnson was favorite. It was the Luke Jokel, Eric Fisher year. He loved Lane Johnson. The Eagles were lucky that he was there at number 4. But Jeff Stoutland was told up front, find us our offensive lineman of the future.
Yeah, and to C-Mac, really quick on like that kind of point in connections, I remember Stoutland being an influence in bringing in one of his former players in Chance Warmack in free agency. But just spinning it back to as far as draftable players, sometimes coaches know enough about the players that they don't want them either. That, hey, I coached this kid for 3 years, and that's not a guy we want in our room on Sundays or throughout the week in the NFL. So I think just having any sort of knowledge or experience or contacts, everybody's different. Every team is different. And I think that's the fun part in trying to understand how these teams make decisions.
Well, one big example of that would be the year Pete Carroll went back to Seattle, and he had the choice. He was picking a safety. He had Earl Thomas versus his guy from USC, Taylor Mays, and he went with Earl Thomas, and that kind of raised eyebrows. It was like, all right, well, if they have such a big need at safety, why would he not take Taylor Mays? Daniel Jeremiah made this point on his podcast a couple weeks ago that he thinks that caused Mays to drop a little bit further than he may have, because it was like, well, if his own college coach who had him for 3 years isn't going to take him, why, there's something wrong here. So to your point, Ben, I think that's a really, really good observation.
And Fran, really quick, the only other thing I'd heard about these position coaches, sometimes they're just the tiebreakers for the scouting departments. And when you have your board pegged and you have 2 guys really close, maybe that's when the position coach comes in and settles all the disputes in that scouting room. And I've heard that from a number of different ways, from picking a top 10 player or maybe picking priority free agents and just trying to stack the board better and alleviate some of those ties in the scouting department.
No, it's a really, really good point. Last question here. Know when to fold them. Left a 5-star review saying the podcast is awesome. Have been an avid listener for years and have been getting to know the key names to look for in the draft as well as their profile from college to the NFL is fascinating and exhilarating. No one does it better. I want to ask you guys, one part of the process that's going on now with the GMs and coaches, as you've pointed out, is running mock drafts to get an idea and have a plan for those options that could be available when the team makes their picks. With the Pro Football Network mock draft simulator out, I highly suggest fans use it. You're able to do something similar to that level. And I was wondering, if you see a worst-case scenario unfolding in the draft where in the practice runs leading up, none of your best options are really available, when do you pull the trigger to move in the draft? For example, let's say at 21, the best players on the board are Cesar Ruiz, Jonathan Taylor, and Austin Jackson. Now, of course, you could just take Ruiz and make him your future center, but it's not a high-priority target. So do you, for example, wait to see when the top receivers are taken, and then depending on if it's earlier or later, make your decision on which direction to move, up, down, or stay? How does that process work? So number one, when it comes to the mock draft situation, typically what teams do is they're going to lean heavy on their pro scouting department. They have a series of pro scouts that are responsible for knowing the rosters, the needs, the trends of every pro team in the league. So each guy is, given 6 to 8 teams or 4 teams that he's got to know inside and out. And whenever that team makes a transaction, that scout now can hand a report up to his boss and say, okay, here's what do we feel about this player. Here's how he could help us or how he wouldn't help us. Now at this time of year, they'll say, okay, look, kind of the conversations we were having at the top of the show about the Denver Broncos. These are the kind of players they trend towards. Here are their needs. Here are the kind of players. There's the player that they could select. Here's who we're seeing they could select. Now you're kind of going through all those different scenarios. So you're going to lean on your pro scouting department. You're going to try and track and see who are they paying attention to. Even though every team is talking to everybody, you're trying to glean as much information as possible. And then you're going to go through every scenario. You're going to talk through everything. But that's why over the last few weeks and in the weeks leading up to this draft here still to come, every general manager is going to be talking with all the other teams about moving down, moving up, gauging interest, getting deals kind of on paper in pencil so that way, when the time comes, you can call a team and say, hey, remember a few weeks ago we talked about this deal. You want to get this done? And if they say yes, now the framework is already created. You're not trying to get that done while the clock is ticking on draft day. So all that stuff happens beforehand. So that way you're not under the gun trying to get something done as fast as possible. And then you end up giving up a little bit more than you would have liked in that scenario and being on the lesser end of a deal. So that's kind of how I see it. Guys, I don't know if you have anything that you want to add to that before we wrap up.
Well, Fran, really quick. Go ahead, C-Mac.
I was just going to say, you look at last year, the point about knowing other teams' needs is so vital because the Eagles saw Andre Dillard sliding. They knew the Houston Texans were ahead of them. They obviously needed offensive line help, and they knew that's where they had to jump up to. Typically, though, in these couple of weeks leading up to the draft, the GMs are talking to say, hey, if our guy is there at 18, look at the Eagles situation. If our guy's there at 18, in theory, what would it take so that some of that roadmap is already done instead of trying, especially with the way things are going to be this year with this virtual draft and how it seems like a lot of teams are on edge about the logistics. It seems like those discussions are going to be so much more vitally important.
And then, Ben, did you have
Fran, do you have a particular opinion on do you think there's any sort of trends we're looking at for the draft this year? Do you see any more trade-ups, trade-backs, maybe stockpiling picks for next year because of the uncertainty with this draft?
Yeah, I've heard people to mention that they feel like some teams may try and trade picks and get more for next year to say like, all right, we're gonna pass on this one and we'll see you next year when we have everything in a normal workflow. I don't know if that'll necessarily be the case across the board or not. I feel that look, every team is going to treat this a little bit differently. And some teams it's going to be a little bit easier than others. Some teams may be a little bit more prepared for this kind of a situation in terms of being able to work remotely, have all their ducks in a row. Obviously, the teams that have been doing this for a long time, all your scouting department, your coaching staff, everybody's in lockstep. The team like the Eagles, for instance, you might feel a little bit better about this kind of situation as opposed to the general manager's first draft. This is the first time running a room. This is the first time this coach is working with this coaching staff with this scouting staff to be able to try and put a draft together. There might be a little bit more stress in that kind of situation. But to me, I don't think that we'll see any other huge trends going by the wayside. I don't know how you feel about it.
Yeah, I'm not really sure. I've heard a lot of different discussions about it, and just the uncertainty behind it is a really interesting, just kind of discussion right now. And I don't really know. I've heard a lot of different scenarios. We're now throwing around the scenario of maybe adding some extra rounds so the priority free agent process isn't that much more of a crapshoot in the Wild West this year. So I'm hearing a lot of different discussions, and it sounds like the NFL and the players and people involved are flexible and willing to try to make this the best out of a bad situation.
Yeah, undrafted free agency, I was interested to see if they were just going to push it till, all right, hey, when teams get back to facilities, that's when that'll kind of open up. You think back to the lockout year, that's kind of how it worked then. Free agents after the draft weren't allowed to sign until the league opened back up. And we're able to sign just like every other free agent. I kind of wondered if they would go the same way here, but we'll see. It'll be very interesting to see what happens.
And behind the scenes there, Fran, there's been a call for priority free agent reform anyways. It's really been a mess the past couple of years. Actually, the past 10, 15 years, it really is just a crapshoot in a Wild West once the draft ends. A lot of teams have wanted a little bit more conformity and a little bit more of a process to it, because it really is. There are very little rules to it. It's a lot of negotiation for signing bonus and things like that. And some teams and scouts have just called for a little bit more reform of that process. So we'll see how it goes moving forward.
Sure. All right. Well, guys, great stuff as always. We will check you out here next week on the Journey to the Draft podcast, driven by AAA. The draft is very, very close. Make sure you go on, leave us a rating, leave us a comment over on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, wherever you listen. Help us boost the show up the rankings. Then we'll see you next week here on the Journey to the Draft podcast, driven by AAA.